Okay, so welcome everybody to the latest N8 Policing Research Partnership report on one of our small grants. As those of you who attended other webinars before will know, these are the final summaries of N8 PRP supported co-produced research grants, which we fund. And so we usually have about 4 of these a year. The final report is up on the website. I've just checked. So if you want to have a look at that afterwards, please do so. How we're going to run today, we've got a presentation from which includes contributions from the 2 partners to this project, which are the University of Manchester and the Greater Manchester Police. We will have a presentation started off by Dr. Sandra Flynn of the University of Manchester. It'll last for about 30 minutes, and then we will open it up for questions. So if you've got any questions as we go along, we'll deal with those afterwards. You can either put them in the chat, or if you just put your hands up, then I will try to come to you in turn, and the team will respond to your questions. So just to clarify, if you're not presenting, could you please switch off your microphone and your camera? And without further ado, I will hand over to Sandra and the team.
Yeah, I'll just let everybody know as well that this is actually being recorded as well. So yeah, please, if you don't want to, well, I'm not sure what we could do to remove you afterwards, but yeah, just let you know that it is being recorded and transcribed. So my name is Sandra Flynn.
Sorry, just Sandra. Yeah, sorry, I should have said that. You're absolutely right. And what we can do is we can obviously edit you out of the recording. If you don't want to appear in this, but do want to ask me a question in person, for example, then just please drop Helen a line and she can edit you out. Sorry, Sandra.
That's okay. So yeah, welcome everybody. I'm going to start just by explaining that our presentation is going to be divided into 4 parts, and all the researchers that worked on the project are going to take a little section each, so you don't get sick of hearing my voice only. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Polly to start us off with the presentation.
Hi everyone. Hopefully you can all see the presentation in the background here. And as Sandra said, my name is Polly. So I'm a forensic psychologist that works at the University of Manchester, and it's been my honour to be part of this team for this very interesting project. So just by way of background, so we know that the rates of sexual offences are on the rise, and this project came about because, if everyone can make sure that their mics are on mute if they're not part of the team, thank you. So yeah, the project came about because we know that the rates of recorded offences are on the rise, but actually the rates of online offences are quite difficult to establish. So DCI Allen, who's with us today, proposed this project in order for us to get a better understanding of the needs of the online offence cohort. So we know that around the Office for National Statistics published their rates in 2020 for the year 2018 to 2019 of around 73,000 sexual offences. And in contact with GMP, it was clear that the management team were really concerned about the rates of online offences that were on the rise as part of that. So there are around 11,000 recorded sexual offences each year to Greater Manchester. So that would represent about 110,000 per decade. So we decided we would kind of look at it on a 10-year time frame to really investigate what was going on with people charged and convicted of online offences. And within that 10-year period, you can see here on the slide, there were around 9,265 crimes related to indecent images of children, with 518 crimes in terms of possession of extreme pornography. So all those offences are recorded under the obscene publications offence, which of course does include other offences. So we were really focused on ensuring we were examining these indecent images offences, and as well as extreme pornography. So on the register at the moment within Greater Manchester, there are around 5,000 offenders, with 3,000 requiring community supervision. However, there are concerns around this group being very much a heterogeneous group, and the management approaches are typically a kind of one size almost fits all. So there was a real concern about better understanding the needs to manage this group better. So in terms of the other drivers for this project, there was the independent review in terms of police-led management of registered offenders in the community by Mick Creedon. And it was noted that whilst the MAPA arrangements were seen as being very, very, very good for bringing together our partners and our agencies in looking at risk and managing and controlling and reducing risk, there's more that needs to be done. So Mick Creedon published his review, in which he recommended that the government should really be commissioning research to understand other ways of managing this group, to think about opportunities for early intervention, to think about non-judicial diversion options for some offenders. And you can all read the kind of key quote from this independent review here about we should really be thinking about different ways to work with this group of offenders, because we know they're not the same as our contact offenders. And I guess in relation to our contact offenders, the research at the moment is very much in its infancy around this area. We think that the research suggests low recidivism rates for people convicted of indecent images, with studies suggesting that it's less than 5% reoffending rates over 4-year periods, and even fewer suggested to progress from an online offence to a contact offence. Yet in practice, our colleagues are telling us something very different. Our colleagues that are working in the front line of controlling, managing risk, reducing risk, are telling us that the reoffending rates are high, and that the recidivism rates differ than what is being published in these papers. The National Crime Agency, for example, has seen this significant increase in terms of arrests and prosecutions for this technology-enabled child sexual abuse. So there was this real drive to understand more. So I'm going to hand over now to Verity to tell you a little bit more about our project and our aims.
Okay, next slide, please, Polly. So as Polly said, we really wanted to have an understanding about how our research could inform management strategies, and to look at the risk factors unique about the pathways to offending from both online to contact offending and vice versa. So we had 4 main aims, and these were to examine the profiles of those arrested for online sexual offences in a 10-year period, examine the pre and post offending patterns of the non-contact online offender cohort, provide an initial analytical profile of the current non-contact online offender to understand the range of crimes incidents recorded, and also investigate the feasibility of linking this information to other data sources so that we could inform risk management and help target resources more effectively. Next slide, please. So to do this, we predominantly used Cognos and identified offenders of crimes recorded by GMP in the 10-year period between the 1st of January 2013 to the 31st of December 2022. And there were a total of 9,783 cases in that period. We took a random sample of these cases, so we selected every 8 case, which resulted in 210 cases for analysis. 7 were removed during our cleaning process, so for instance, if they were duplicates or they were outside of our criteria, and that left 203 cases, of which there were 15 that were extreme pornography cases only, and 188 that were of indecent images of children and extreme pornography cases combined. So we then used a variety of sources to collect data on each case. So we predominantly used local intelligence via the Police Works database to search for each offender, and this was supplemented with access to the PNC. Using these data sets, we accessed a range of information, including demographics, details of the offence, history of offending, and also any monitoring or supervision violations. So for some cases, additional data was also available from GMP forensic case files, which actually helped us minimise some of the missing data. And colleagues in the Sex Offender Management Unit also able to provide us some information on risk levels for cases on the register managed by the unit. So you can see that we gathered a range of information from different sources. And with that, I will hand over to Sandra for the results of the project.
Thanks, Verity. So as Verity said, we've taken a random sample of all of those offenders or those crimes that have been recorded by GMP over a 10-year period. So we're looking at just giving you the results now of a sample of 188 crimes that were committed during that period. We have got more detailed analysis that we hope to publish at a later date. So this is just kind of a snapshot really of what we've done so far. So I'll just give you, first of all, start with an overview of the demographic characteristics of the sample of indecent image offenders. So probably quite as you would expect really, or if you're familiar with the literature, within our sample, the kind of mean age of offenders was 42. And they did range from a youngest age of 18 up to the age of 80. Again, probably as you'd expect, most of the offenders here were males. 96% were male. Only a very small proportion were female, and then we did have a percentage, 2% that said prefer not to say or didn't give their gender. The majority of the people in the sample were UK nationals, and again, 80% were from an ethnic minority, from a white ethnic background. And we looked at employment. We weren't able to go into a lot of detail in terms of what particular jobs the individuals were doing, but we found that 46% of the sample were in employment at the time of this target offence, and 26% were unemployed. Then we had other categories such as students and people who were retired. And then we had 3% of the sample were actually deceased just shortly after the target offence. So that could have been from natural causes or from suicide, for example. Next slide, Polly. Thank you. So in terms of the actual target offence itself, that was randomly selected over that 10-year period. We found that most people were suspected of possessing indecent images of children. So that's possessing physical or digital indecent photographs or pseudo photographs of a child. So that's around 67% of those crimes were for possession. So we're using here the main categories that GMP used to record the crimes of indecent images. So the second category would be involving taking a photograph or making an indecent image, such as a video. And 25 of our sample, that's 13%, actually produced an indecent image. Then we've got 15% who were suspected of making indecent images. So this is slightly different from taking the images. It's more about downloading to a device or reproducing an image, so you're making it that way. And finally, our final category was distributing images. So we only had a small proportion of the crimes where people were suspected of distributing an image, either through sharing a digital file, either by on social media or sending it via an email or uploading it to a chat room, or other platforms. So in terms of the category of imagery, so this was unknown in around 40% of cases. So it wasn't always recorded of the severity of the categories. So there's 3 categories, A, B, and C, with A being the most serious category. But in the majority of cases, in a small proportion of cases, that was unknown. But we did, for those that we did have information on, we found that a lot of people had images that fell into all 3 different categories. So from most serious A to C. Okay, thanks, Polly. So in terms of the actual offence outcome, so what happened to individuals after the target offence? We found that 52% were actually charged with an offence. An additional 3% were cautioned and 3% were summoned. So just over half were actually charged or cautioned or summoned. Over a quarter of the suspects were not charged because there was insufficient evidence. So that might be, for example, it might be because a device was, the images were found on a device within a shared home, for example. So it was unable to actually identify who was the person who downloaded or took possession of those images. Okay, next slide, Polly. So in terms of the management of these offenders, following a charge, we found that there was 102 people were subject to or were required to notify the police after the offence. So they were, as people were referred to, being signed on to required to sign on to the sex offender register. And of these people who were charged as well, 86% also received a sexual harm order. So that's some additional conditions to being on the sex offender register. There may be some additional conditions that they were required to adhere to. For those who were required to register with the police following the offence, we had information about their risk rating. So we found that 25, so combining high and very high, 25 were high or very high risk, 38 were considered to be medium risk, 30 as low risk. And we had some individuals where the risk wasn't actually recorded, either because they were deceased or their risk wasn't assessed, or that information had been archived and we couldn't access that. So in terms again of the management, for those people who were required to register, a third of these people actually did breach their conditions, and 52% breached their conditions more than once. And when people did commit a further offence, we found that 56% committed a further sexual offence. Okay, thanks. So we also were very interested in whether their offending history. So first of all, starting off with, well, what was their offending history before our target offence? Were they already known to the police, for example? So we used data from the PNC to go back and look at our 188 cases. And we found that 64%, so 2/3 of people, did have a history of offending. And of those people who did have a history of offending, 44% committed at least one previous sexual offence. So we know that 16% had previous contact sexual offence, so like a physical sexual contact offence, and 25% had previous online sexual offence before the target offence. And interestingly, we had 20% of the sample who had no previous offending at all, or no subsequent post-target offending. So that was their kind of a one-off offence for them. Okay, thanks. So in terms of what happened after the target offence, so we, of our sample of 188, we found that 89 people, 47%, did go on to reoffend. Now, in terms of what type of offences, in most cases that was a further sexual offence, but it also involves general offending, and it could be like theft, for example, or motoring offences. But in the majority of cases, they did commit a further sexual offence. And of those people who did go on to reoffend, we knew that 73% had been required to sign on to the sex offender register, and 83% had actually had additional conditions through the civil order of the sexual harm prevention order. Okay, so just the last slide for me, just to give you an overview really of some of the descriptive factors, but looking at different profiles or different types of offenders within our group, which we have gone into greater detail in further analysis that's available in our report. But we looked at our one-time offender group, and they were slightly older than the other offenders at age 47. But only like 10% of this group were actually charged with an offence. And as you can see from there, none of them were required to sign the register, and none of them received a prison sentence either. So these are kind of the first-time offenders, had no history of offending. And some of the offences, if we looked at more detail at the types of offending, they were maybe just receiving an image, for example, rather than making or creating images themselves. Then we had 75 of the offenders were classed as repeat online sexual offenders. Within this group, a much higher proportion were actually then charged with an offence, so 79% were charged with the offence. So only a small proportion that was considered to be either not in the public interest or there was insufficient evidence to prosecute them. Again, majority of these, 3/4 were required to sign the sex offender register, and 41% did receive a custodial sentence. And then we looked at another group of contact offenders, so those people who either had committed a sexual contact offence before the target offence, or then went on to escalate and commit a further contact offence. And again, we found that 64% here were charged with an offence. Insufficient evidence within 32%. Risk factor was higher with this group at 44%, but had a very high risk. And 56% received a prison disposal. So that's kind of just a quick overview of the findings from the study. And as I said, we've got a more detailed, we've got a brief summary report, but we do have a more detailed report, and we hope to be publishing the findings as well in journal articles. But I'll pass you on now to Katie just to finish us off with some of the implications and key recommendations.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for dialing in, and thank you to my colleagues for very eloquently outlining our study. Did it much better than I could have done. But I'm here to talk through the key messages and findings and where we head after this. So what we do know is that most recorded offences were for possession, but there was a note at the bottom of that slide that may well be due to the way we can gather evidence and the way that the Crown can accept evidence in the courts, and also how offending has progressed online. Because what we do know, particularly through our lived experience as police officers, that online child sexual abuse develops and adapts according to how we are progressing evidence and finding evidence. So the prevalence of possession-only offences might be more in the way of how we prove these offences, and we're starting to see less possession charges coming through because now people have things floating around in the cloud, for example, rather than physically downloading to a device. What we do know is that only half of those that recorded were charged with an offence. The half that were required to provide notification by the sex offenders register, most were also subject to a sexual harm prevention order. And what we do know nationally is that the more interventions that are put in place and the more that people learn about this, it is highly likely that if you're convicted of a indecent image offence, you are going to get a sexual harm prevention order. What we saw was that of 102 on the sex offender register, 56% then went on to commit a further sexual offence, either indecent or a contact offence. What I find really interesting as a police officer with this one is one of the reasons I initiated this study right at the beginning, which was outlined by Polly, was that nationally the narrative is that sex offenders rarely reoffend and that the percentage is quite low. And if you look at the reoffending figures published across all offence types, sex offender reoffending rates is the lowest, with acquisitive criminals, burglars, shoplifters example, being the higher end of the reoffending. But our study obviously negated that with our results. Now, the lived experience of being a police officer, having worked with sex offenders for many years, is that indecent image offending and online child sexual offending is we see reoffending in this area quite significantly, and that result supports our narrative there. Overall 89, so 47% reoffended after their target audience, and 82% of those that reoffended committed a further sexual offence. So what we're reading into this as police officers is that traditional sex offender management might not be the most effective approach for online sexual offending. What we can demonstrate is that once they are identified as a risk to children online, we are good at managing them in that we identify further offences, but it can become a little bit of a circle where we're not actually having any kind of rehabilitative impact. And with the volume of crimes that are further coming in, it means that it might become a never-ending spiral where we are constantly playing cat and mouse. And 20% had no previous or post-offending history, and the target offence was a one-time offence. So it's actually the smallest number is the ones who commit it once. The majority of our offenders went on to commit a further offence. What's also notable from the previous slide is that the risk assessment seems better at identifying contact risk than it does internet-based risk, which is something else that we brought at the beginning of this study. So next slide, please, Polly. So the implications, we do have to talk about data quality. It's prevalent in most studies that happen within policing, unfortunately. Most forces use different intelligence systems, and the data that's held within them is open to human error and changes in data systems. This study was based off Greater Manchester data, and they had been through a change from what was called Opus to IOPS. There was lots of data gaps within that, and that meant that there were some gaps, but we've managed to produce what we have from there. Data linkage, so we weren't given access to VISA, which is the Violent and Sex Offender Register system. That is where the majority of information is held about registered sex offenders, and we weren't provided access to that for the purpose of this study. So we worked off IOPS, which is GMP's Intelligence and Crime Recording System. So there are, if we were to be given VISA access in the future, there's a lot more data that we would have access to, and we'll be able to cross-reference with a lot more quality information around these offenders, for example, category of images, type of offending, what they were thinking about at the time of the offence, and so on. So due to the volume and diversity of offenders, managing indecent image sexual offenders is time, resource intensive, and the numbers increase annually. The reason I approached NA Research Partnership and approached my colleagues in Manchester University right at the beginning is because we are seeing a significant increase in registered sex offender numbers. The better we get at identifying online child abuse and prosecuting for such, the bigger the sex offender register becomes. None of which is negative, but what I wanted to look at is our current approach to offender management effective? Is it reducing the risk of harm to children online? And what we're seeing here is potentially not. And what we wanted to identify here is whether there is a better way to manage the risk posed to children online, understanding different pathways to why these people reoffend and how we could better intervene and prevent, rather than just the constant detect and put them back inside and reconvict. Catch and convict is the term we use here in policing. So we were looking for signposting options, diversion to treatment, the fact that interventions may reduce reoffending because this traditional approach of catch and convict, although we are identifying the cohort and we are addressing the cohort and we are reconvicting the cohort, what we're not doing, it would seem, is managing to rehabilitate and reduce that reoffending rate. And so we were looking for alternatives to current management approaches, and we believe that this suggests that some are needed. Next slide, please, Polly. So we do want to continue this research. It's been really, really interesting. I would say one of the hardest things we've had to face in the 12 months is keeping ourselves on track, because the more we look at this, the more things we find, the more opportunities and avenues we've wanted to go down. But we've been really clear that this was a 12-month project, and it was an initial project to find the data to support our hypothesis so we could continue moving forward. So what we'd like to do is we'd like to understand the motivations for offenders who possess, create, make, take and distribute indecent images of children, and help us inform pathways to further desistance. We'd like to understand the long-term impact of being placed on the register and labelled a sex offender. Something anecdotally I find really interesting from this study is the volume of offenders that are in employment at the time of their conviction. What I know, again anecdotally from being a sex offender manager, is that quite often we cause our sex offenders to lose their employment. We will often disclose to the employer the conviction, the nature of the conviction, and most roles in this day and age involve some kind of computer access, at which point we are very heavily monitoring, and employers are often reluctant to engage with that. So we wanted to look at, is that the right thing? Is that having a benefit, or could that potentially be contributing to the reasons why people are continuing in this never-ending spiral of reoffending? So we want to explore whether therapeutic interventions and referrals to treatment programmes prior to being charged could be explored as an alternative to the current universal approach, which applies everybody convicted of a sexual offence goes on the sex offenders register and they get managed in this very traditional, very rigid way. And we wanted to look at researching the need for the mental health impact and stigma associated with being on the sex offenders register. We know that there's 100 times increased risk of suicidal behaviour, but also if we label people as bad people and we label them as sex offenders, are we pushing them into that societal group so that they continue with that offending rather than being able to step out of that offending behaviour and become a positive contributing member of society? Next slide, please. So the conclusion, So an offender was charged, summoned and cautioned in only 52% of the recorded target offence. Of the total sample, half reoffended, mostly for committing another sexual offence. Reoffending rates are substantially higher than that's reported in the literature, and we did have a quick look at why this might be, and we think that most of the studies have looked at the same offence type, but what we've outlined in this study is actually what they're charged with as an online sexual offence very much depends on the way they've committed the offence and what we can convince the Crown of evidentially. So looking for possession, it's only a reoffence if they then get convicted again of possession. We looked wider, they might have a possession and then they might have distributed the next time, for example. One size fits all approach to the sex offender management is not effective for reducing recidivism, not in online offending. Again, I mentioned on some of the previous slides, our risk assessment seems to be a lot more traditional, a lot more in line with contact offending, and we could argue that the traditional sex offender management approach is good for contact offending, but what we're showing here is that online offending is different and has a different pattern of behaviour. Indecent images of children offenders require a different management strategy from contact sexual offenders, and at the moment they're treated the same. And new treatment and behavioural interventions need to be explored and trialled. What we do know is that management of online offending is extremely challenging. It's extremely expensive for police forces. We're constantly having to buy new technology that can track this type of behaviour. We're constantly having to keep one step ahead, and it's an extremely resource intensive, difficult and expensive tactic, which what we're trying to say here is it might not actually be the most effective in all cases. And yeah, that's me.
Thank you, Katie. I just want us just to say as well, I just want to thank our research assistant, Lily, who's not on the call today, but she did an awful lot of the data collection and work extracting the data from various different sources, and it wasn't an easy job, as you can imagine, viewing and going through those files. So big thank you to Lily for that. So yeah, that's it from us, Jeff. Happy to take any questions.
Right, thank you, and congratulations to the team for such an excellent project and a really good summary of what you did and what the findings were and recommendations. So we can open it up for questions. So ideally, if you could put your hand up if you're able to ask the question in person, we'll do it on a first come first served basis. But if you're not able to do that, if you could pop the question in the chat, that would work too. So can't see anybody just yet. So I have a question with my law head on, which is to what extent forces have the flexibility when it comes to these decisions, bearing in mind, presumably there are very extensive Crown Prosecution Service guidelines in terms of how you handle these kind of offences. To what extent do you actually have the wriggle room as a force within that, and also to what extent do you think the CPS would be open to revisiting those guidelines based on what you've said?
So I absolutely wouldn't want to answer on behalf of the Crown Prosecution Service because it would be grossly unfair, I would say, and I would probably grossly misquote them as well. But what we do know is that we've used out-of-court disposals in other offence types with great success. So when we first had a conversation, we were looking at potentially doing some kind of conditional caution for a first-time offence with the option of completing a diversion treatment programme. And obviously, if it was failed compliance, then the conviction would go through as normal. So it's almost offering that first step of an alternative route. Whether it would be accepted for this offence type, that's something we would have to explore if we continued. But what I do know is it has worked. It has worked for all kinds of other offence types. Really successful with burglary, but you can't really compare this offence with burglary. But then we have seen similar options with domestic abuse, which I would say is a little bit more in line with sexual offending. And it does seem to have some success. So that is where we would like to look.
I guess the other thing, sorry, Jeff, just to add, there's initiatives in parts of the country where we're trying to normalise and encourage people to come forward when they think they're at risk. So before the police get involved. And those initiatives are doing good work. You know, we're helping people understand the risk that they present with and helping them meet their needs that offending might fulfil to avoid them offending. So there's also that sort of work that might be relevant there.
Okay, thanks, and sorry for putting you on the spot, Katie. So we've got a question in the chat from Leona, which is, are you planning on doing any further research around sexual harm prevention orders and breaches of these? And then we'll come to, I think it's Michelle who has a hand up.
So it's definitely an area that we're interested in pursuing. I think this is a first step when obviously Katie came to us with the idea of wanting to do this, and we wanted to form that kind of partnership and collaboration, and being able to do an exploratory study through the N8 was a real great opportunity just to see what the data looks like and what can we do. And I think so looking at sexual harm prevention orders and their effectiveness and everything attached to that, I think is something we would really love to be able to explore in the future. But that obviously requires access to data and also further funding, which is quite difficult. We have applied for funding in this area since finishing this report in February, without success. So it's always going to be a tricky area to study, both access to data due to confidentiality, of course, but also, you know, prioritising funding in this area as well is quite difficult. So yes, it's definitely been considered.
And I know that generally civil preventative orders full stop can be an absolute nightmare to research, because it's not just actually who's got what order, but it's actually what are those conditions and who's managing those conditions, and actually is anybody keeping track of them. But as everyone would say to this, to all our research teams that have done small grants, NAPRP are here to help. If you want to put in a funding bid for more money, we'll please have a chat with us, and we'll see if we can help in terms of that work. So we'll take the next question, which is from Michelle Parker.
Yeah, hi. I work in Visor at the moment, but my background is in programs, so this is like really interesting to sort of listen about how much more potentially we could be doing in terms of interventions. But I think the general feeling is that it's not the police's role to rehabilitate. So I'm just wondering if there is anything at the moment that's being thought of in terms of how these people might access interventions, because probation is stretched and they only offer really sort of horizon, which with a lot of the men that I work with just wouldn't even kind of touch the sides in terms of their offending behaviour. So I'm just kind of wondering if anyone's had any thoughts about how they're going to get this intervention, what that's going to look like, how we can kind of work better to get to that point.
I don't know, Polly, if you've had any thoughts on that as our forensic psychologist.
I'm afraid I'm going to defer to Katie in terms of the realities, because obviously I work at the very, very far end in high security, where programmes are much more accessible than say they would be in the community perhaps. So I think I'll go to Katie for first thoughts on that one.
No, it's a really good question, and it's a really good point. And as a police officer myself, I absolutely agree that it isn't purely a police responsibility. And actually, that was one of the reasons I've asked for this research to be done in the first place, because we just cannot carry on the way we are. The volume is huge. The request of us is massive. Policing these orders, which has been alluded to in the last question around how resource intensive it is to actually police these orders. So it can be seen a little bit as when one's given at court, that's a win, we've succeeded, but actually to really get the benefit, it needs really robust policing, which is very expensive and very resource intensive. And when you look at the volume of people, it just isn't sustainable, especially with the volume that are continually coming. So I completely agree that it isn't the police's responsibility to provide and manage treatment programs, but we also can't carry on the way it is. So when we had the initial conversations, we weren't looking at the police picking this up. We certainly weren't looking at the police delivering the treatment programs. I don't think that would be appropriate at all. And our next step would likely be approaching mental health and them rather than probation, because this would not be a probation programme, because we are looking at out of court options rather than once you're convicted, you run this with probation. Obviously, we are aware of the programmes that have been run in prisons, and we are aware of the programmes that have been run by probation, and this isn't us repeating that. We're aware of the issues that have happened there. We're aware of what's gone wrong. This would be considering the social implications, as I alluded to on the last slides as well, around the labelling of sex offenders in the first place, of putting them all in one basket and expecting the police to manage everybody. 5,000 people in Manchester, it's just too high. So we will be looking to other agencies, which might be mental health. We haven't approached them yet because this was very much a data gathering initial step in the first 12 months.
Thank you.
And a question from Dave Thompson.
Sorry, thank you, everyone. This was a really fascinating research, so congratulations to everyone for this. I have lots and lots of questions, and too many questions to answer. But I just wondered, Katie, if I can ask the first question to you in terms of the workload of officers in sex offender management in GMP. What are the numbers of officers to nominals, offenders, individuals that you're working with currently?
So I have actually transferred from GMP to Cheshire, so it would be very unfair for me to say as of today this is their numbers, because I don't know. I've been in Cheshire since October last year, but when I left they were running at under the recommended 50. So we've lost the 50 recommendation so sorry, for my colleagues who aren't in the police, it was previously recommended that a sex offender manager would manage no more than 50 registered sex offenders, any more than 50, and it was seen as too many. That number seems to have been around for a long time. I think that number was actually produced before internet offending existed. I would argue if it was reassessed and it was redone, it would probably be a lot lower, considering how demanding it is to manage internet offenders especially. However, they were running under that. They were running at about an average of 1 to 47 when I left, which was October last year. Here in Cheshire, very similar. We're running at about 1 to 47 on average. So I'm not working with people who have insanely high cohorts, which I know have been seen previously. GMP did have that previously. So within our 10-year period that we were testing, they could have had really, really high cohorts. But yeah, as I left, it was under the recommendation.
Thank you. Yeah, that's actually answered the second question I had as well. Thank you for that.
Okay, are there any other questions before we wrap up? Yes. We've got two questions. One from Niall, have I pronounced that right? First question. You're on mute.
Hi, can you hear me? Hi, there's not many people actually get my name right, so thank you. People usually say the J is in the name, but yeah, it's Niall, so thank you. That's really made my day, that. No, really interesting, so thank you for what you've shared. Amazing work. I'm a trauma-informed therapist, and I work for an organisation called We Are Survivors in Manchester, who support men who have been experienced rape, sexual exploitation, recent or historic. And the one thing that I'm really fascinated with looking at your future research is understanding the motivations of offenders, particularly those who have a history of being a survivor and then going on to become a perpetrator. So that'd be something I'm really interested in if that was something you were going to do in the future. Really fascinated with, especially with the work that I do already. So I just wanted to add that in, but thank you for sharing everything you've done.
I don't know if you've already seen the work by Lisa out of Merseycare around EMDR.
Okay.
for and a surname has escaped me as I need to give it to you. If you drop me an email on polly.turner@Manchester, I can send you that paper. So she's published on her work with EMDR with offenders, and she really feels strongly that it reduces the deviant arousal. I'm yet to be convinced about just such a, kind of what you might consider a brief intervention can work so powerfully yet. But Lisa is a big believer, so I can send you the paper.
Oh, that'd be amazing. Thank you. So Polly.Turner.
Yeah, at manchester.ac.uk.
At Manchester.
I've gone completely blank on Lisa's surname. I'm so sorry about that.
Oh, not a problem. No, I really appreciate that, Polly. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. And there's some comments in the chat as well on what's happening in Manchester and Police Scotland as well, for those that are interested. And I think we have one more question. I thought somebody else had their hand up, but that's John Davison.
Thanks. Can you hear me okay? I don't think my camera's working.
Yeah, can hear you fine.
Great. My background actually is probation and currently work in Cheshire. I'm seconded to the PCC's office working on serious violence reduction on behalf of the partnership in Cheshire. So my question is coming really from a serious violence reduction perspective, and just wondering, in terms of thinking about, possibly commissioning a service, whether there has been, colleagues on the call have made any connections with the VRUs. Clearly, there's a VRU in Manchester. We haven't got a VRU in Cheshire, but Katie, we have already spoken, and I'm kind of thinking if you haven't made those kind of connections, it might be helpful to to share that research, see where it fits with the thinking around serious violence, the agenda. So that was one point I wanted to make, just to say, it might be helpful to make those connections. Just from a Cheshire perspective, again, Katie, you may know this or may not, but it's interesting. The research was based, I think you said, on 2 years of data from GMP. We're just testing out a software system in Cheshire for our violence reduction work, and we've actually got 10 years of Cheshire police data that we're currently analysing. And my understanding is it would be relatively easy to kind of pick something like internet offending and do something similar. So I think it'd be really interesting to kind of ask that data set some of the questions you kind of asked in Greater Manchester in terms of the police data, and see what level of kind of correlation there is in terms of the findings in from your data research and what we can now find out from a Cheshire perspective. And then the final thing that just came to mind, there was two things. One, there was reference to probation and the programs that are run. I know nationally there is all our programs have been reviewed. I thought there was a particular offer for online offending, so I will check that out beyond Horizon, but I'll check that out. But I've spent a lot of time working in MAPA, in that area of work, and when we look at that from a in terms of managing high harm offenders, we tend to come at it in terms of external controls and internal controls. And I was kind of interested, and have to say, when I chair those meetings, I tended to start with what external controls can we put into place, and then work on developing the internal, because they tend to take longer. And I'm just wondering whether there's anything, any tools in the box there really around external controls. I know I'm talking to a couple of policing colleagues in Cheshire again at the moment around polygraph testing, just as an example of some of the things we're thinking about. So just a few things there from me, hopefully helpful.
So the software that you're talking about is ARC, and we did consult with ARC really early on in this project, and it was decided at that stage that we needed to do the manual research because there wasn't enough I'm going to sound like I know what I'm talking about, and I really, really don't, so I'll probably get it really wrong, but there wasn't enough data already to be able to build ARC around this particular offending set. So it was felt that it wasn't right at this stage, but we looked at it might be something that we embrace going forward. It was 10 years worth of data that we looked at, not 2, so it's very similar to Cheshire. We might be able to do it, but what we found was we really needed that research analyst, because the data is here, there and everywhere. It's we had to read into people's statements, etc. So ARC as a AI tool wouldn't have been able to produce the results that we have got at the end of this, which is why we couldn't go forward with it at that stage. But I am very aware of ARC. Obviously, I do have IOM under my responsibility here in Cheshire, so I'm working with yourself on that anyway. So I'll always consider it. I am aware of it. We did look at it at the beginning of this, but it's not as straightforward as it initially sounded to us, which is why we couldn't go ahead. Treatment programs available in probation. I'm really conscious that all the questions have been around treatment programs, and the comments are saying that there's already treatment programs in existence. What this study absolutely isn't is us just looking to design a new treatment program. That's not what we were looking at all. We're looking at the sex offender register in its entirety, whether it's the right thing, whether in the current model of sex offender management with policing and the responsibilities that are put on policing, is that effective? What we need to be aware of is the volume of these people that are coming through. So in Cheshire, in the last 4 weeks, we've had 55 new registered sex offenders. That's in Cheshire. It's a really small number comparatively to GMP. So they only have about 1,500 sex offenders in the community, but 55 in 4 weeks is massive, and that's normal. That's the normal of what we're seeing. So you're absolutely right about external factors. You're absolutely right about polygraph and about policing of these orders. But what the point of this study is at the rate that they're flying in, the more that come on, the harder it is to manage, and it's not sustainable. What we're showing is that they do reoffend. So absolutely we can polygraph, absolutely we can check devices, absolutely we can have remote monitoring software, but every time we deploy those, one time in 2, it's just a little bit more, it's finding that yes, they've reoffended. That's all creating resource and demand for policing that just isn't sustainable. So the purpose of this study is not to offer a treatment programme for people that are on the register, it's to look at it in its entirety. Is this model sustainable? Can we continue as we are? And is the way we're working having an impact on keeping the public safe, which I would suggest potentially not. So I don't want people to leave this thinking that this is just us designing a new treatment programme. It absolutely isn't. It's looking at the sex offenders register, the model that we have currently, and whether that's sustainable.
Thanks, Katie.
Thanks, Katie. And we're coming up to the hour, so I'd like to thank the team for their presentation and for fielding the questions. And good luck in any future research bids. And please come to us and ask if we can provide assistance in any way. I've just put the link to the report up on in the chat. So please take a look at that if you're interested. That should have contact details of everybody as well if you want to make further inquiries. On the N8 PRP website, we've got all the reports from our small grants over the last 9 or 10 years. Helen, is there anything I should be adding before we wrap up?
Just briefly to keep an eye out for new events that we've got coming on. The major event that we've got planned at the moment is the Drugs Policing Conference on the 2nd of July. The main programme's on the 2nd of July. There's also pre-conference events on the 1st of July. There's currently a discount available for all registrations for that conference, £25 off until the 21st of May. So if you're a public sector employee, it's I think £65 at the moment. If you're a new researcher, so PhD or PDRA, it's only £50. And for full delegates, so academics, it's currently £95. So please do come along if that's something you'd be interested in, or share that with your colleagues in your professional networks. Yes, I'll have the recording for this and the slides up as well once there's a bit of faffing about to do with YouTube and so forth, but then it'll be up, and I'll email all the attendees to say that they're available. So thanks.
Brilliant. Yes, the event's actually at the University of Manchester, so it's a post-COVID physical event where you can actually sort of see people in 3 dimensions. Anyway, thanks for the presentation again. Thanks everybody for joining. Please check the website for future events that are coming up, and we will wrap up there. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.